Hi, Dr. P here to urge you to accept your game design for what it is, not what you want it to be. And of course, I'll explain. This notion of accepting what is a common phenomenon. For example, in the National Football League, the mantra is, take what the defense gives you. In other words, focus on where you can be most effective. In game design, this translates into something like this. Accept what works best for the game. Accept what the game wants to be, quote unquote, rather than what you want it to be. Don't mess it up. If you try to force it to be something it's not, you're likely to mess it up. Of course you are. Remember, there are lots of games to make, not just one. If this game isn't what you wanted, you can make another. The idea is to make good games, not necessarily the good game that you had in mind when you started or the good game that you thought you were going to do when you started. It's to make good games. And if you make a lot of games, the ones you really want to make will finally come. Now, if you're overly constrained by contracts, then you have a problem, because the contract may specify you have to make this game, and you may have to force your game to conform. There are advantages to being indie or freelance, where you're not constrained by such contracts. Now, novelists know this kind of thing happening very well. There are the rare novelists who plot everything out ahead of time. There are the rare novelists who outline nothing. They just start writing. Most fall in between. They make some kind of plan, an outline, but as they write, they find that the book, and especially the characters, go in directions that the author did not anticipate and did not intend. And yet that's what happens, and that's what they write, because what they intended didn't fit. So the novelist can say the character made something else happen, or the character didn't want to, or the character would never do that. And they have to, because if they don't, and they just make the characters do things as though they were puppets, the readers will notice, and the book will suffer. Well, a game designer can say, the game turned out to be something different than I intended, or that's not what the game was. But once again, I think if the designer tries to force a game into something that it's not, then the players will notice. They won't perhaps recognize what's happening, but they'll notice, because the game will not be as good as it might have been. Now, you might say, how can an imaginary character cause this to a novelist? It's because the purpose of the characters is to feel real. The characters take on a life of their own, even in the mind of the creator. Ask a successful novelist. Well, I think the same sort of thing happens, or can happen, in games. A game can make its own way, take its own direction. Part of your job as a game designer is to recognize what's best for the game, not to make it conform to your notions. Again, if you're not compelled by a contract to follow a particular direction. Some examples. At a designer playtest meeting, a colleague brought in a card game about Dachshunds. Yes, she has wiener dogs, and she loves her wiener dogs. So each player has 3 puppies, and the object is to get all of them to flip onto their backs to get scritched at the same time. Now, does this sound like a game for small children? I think it does, and it played like it too. Now, the play can certainly be improved, but it'll never be more than a children's game, I think, though I think also she wants it to be more. Will she accept what the game is? I don't know. Only time will tell. My own example is from Sea Kings. I have an unpublished pirates game that's one of my best. It's about as close to a story game as I can come. And at some point I decided to try to make a Viking game derived from the pirates game. But I quickly found myself in new territory. The pirates game is a combination of historical pirates, and the life of an historical pirate tended to be nasty, brutish, and short, and romantic pirates, especially from a certain series of Disney movies. It's a combination. Well, when I started Sea Kings, it took on a different identity. It became history, not romance. And I confess, I don't know much about romance and Vikings. I don't think they're very romantic, but I knew a lot about historical Vikings, and that may have affected it too. The game also became very simple, a very simple game to play. So though I intended it to be an entertainment, I found it had become a good educational game as well. Educational games have to be simple to play. And then when I showed it to a publisher amongst many other games, and they took a great interest in it, they suggested that I add a second version that was more directly confrontational, even though that wasn't realistic, that wasn't historical. But by doing so, I was able to have it appeal to an additional audience. So that worked out pretty well. And I'm pretty happy with the published game. It was published in 2015. Now this whole idea of accepting what something is can apply to careers sometimes. As I was doing this screencast, I thought about one of Sweden's most well-known composers, Franz Berwald. He was mostly obscure in his own day. He wanted to be known for his operas, but there was a period of a few years when he wrote 4 symphonies. What do we hear today? Only the symphonies. It's too bad there aren't more of them. When you're making games, make the game that the game wants to be. Maybe those will be your symphonies. If you try to force them to be operas, to stretch the analogy a little bit too far, then maybe they won't be so good and you won't be as successful. The ultimate question then is, how much do you push a game to be something other than what it is? You have to, of course, to improve a weak game. You have to change it. But do you change its identity? You have to decide this on a game-by-game basis. Thanks for listening.